Hello and welcome to IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Our guest today needs probably less introduction than any guest we've had in a long time as a former DG of the Institute. David O'Sullivan, it's a pleasure to have you back. David, as you know, as our audience knows, is currently the EU Sanctions Enforcer. He's done many other jobs in the European Commission, as well as leading the entire Commission as a civil servant. DG Trade, and he was in the EU's diplomatic representative in Washington during the first term of Donald Trump. Today, we're looking at the issue of sanctions and discussing various aspects of how things are evolving, particularly in relation to sanctions on Russia and cooperation with other partner countries on those sanctions. So with that, David, thanks so much for joining us, particularly as it's a holiday there in Brussels where you are.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dan. It's great to be back at the Institute, for which I retain great affection and respect. I love to see the yellow door in the background there. And it is indeed, it's a blazing 27 degrees in Brussels today. So I'm really sacrificing to come online today. No, that's a joke.
Well, we won't keep you too long. So look, just to start off and maybe zoom out rather than look at the minute by minute stuff that's almost going on at the moment. We'll come to that in a while. But just standing back and looking at the whole issue of sanctions, there's been many debates and questions and books written about sanctions, their efficacy, how countries learn to get around them. Over your past 2 years as doing this job, share some of your thoughts on how effective sanctions are, how they've changed over time, how people have learned to make them more effective, how the sanctioned countries have learned to mitigate them, a general view on the whole sanctions regime globally.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, I have to confess, before I took this job, I mean, I'm something of a sanctions skeptic. I always thought that people tended to overestimate the value of sanctions, and all too often, I'm afraid, they tended to be the instrument of last recourse because no one could think of anything else, right? So it was, oh, we have to do something. What can we do? Let's do sanctions. Obviously, in this situation and in relation to Russia, it was unthinkable that we would not impose a massive barrage of sanctions on Russia following the full-scale invasion. Of course, sanctions are still only a part of the total approach, starting with military assistance, macroeconomic assistance, development and humanitarian assistance, political assistance, such as fast-tracking the Ukrainian membership of the European Union to give the people of Ukraine a clear perspective of a brighter future. But then sanctions are very important. And we have never had sanctions against any country such as we now have against Russia. Before the war, we were trading somewhere around 260 billion a year with Russia. We now trade 60 billion. So that's a drop of some 75%. I mean, this is massive. By the way, the relative figures for the US, just as a point of reference, were 35 billion and now 3 billion. So we traded much more extensively with Russia than, say, the US did. And the sanctions dig much more deeply into the economic and commercial fabric of our member states than any previous sanctions. The previous biggest sanctions were against Iran in relation to the nuclear weapons program back in 2012. And that was a one product embargo. Basically, it was about oil. With the Russian sanctions, we have financial sanctions, we have sectoral sanctions, we have energy sanctions. I mean, it covers, in terms of trade alone, it covers 7,500 products. So this has required a massive learning curve for our member states, because as you know, sanctions are adopted at the European level, but are enforced and implemented by the member states individually. So they've all had to rethink a bit how they do this, because previously, it was seen as a prerogative of foreign ministries. It was a sort of foreign policy issue. Suddenly, you have to start thinking about your customs people, your ministries of industry or economics, your prosecutors, your police, your investigators, your criminal prosecutions. So there's been quite a steep learning curve. Having said that, I will stop here, but what I'd like to say in the next phase is, what's been the impact? Because I think there has been some skepticism about whether they are actually having the impact that was wished for, and maybe there was a bit of overselling in the early days, implying the Russian economy would be brought to its knees within a matter of months, which of course is clearly not the case. But I think I have a fairly good number I can do on why sanctions are actually having, at this stage, a really major impact on the Russian economy.
And to follow up on that, there is an argument that the sanctions have actually pushed the Russian economy more towards a war economy, and that in itself is an added incentive for the Russians to keep fighting. Do you have any thoughts on that? That if the war were to stop, the effect on the economy would be significant. Now, of course, a war economy can't continue forever, but demilitarizing and winding down a war effort, as has happened in the past in other countries, particularly after the Second World War, can lead to bringing on recession. Any concern that that's actually a perverse incentive?
Well, I totally agree that the Russian economy is now a dual economy. There's, on the one hand, a war economy, and on the other hand, the civil economy. And the war economy has developed quite well from that perspective, and the civil economy is being hugely damaged. It's anybody's bet whether, if there were to be a ceasefire, Mr. Putin would stop investing in the war economy. I think one of the great nervousnesses on the European side is exactly that, having built this war machine, Mr. Putin is fairly determined to continue to use it. So even if we have a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, there is a risk of those hostilities restarting or Mr. Putin moving elsewhere. And there have certainly been noises from the NATO world of people projecting that the extent of Russia's dependence on the war economy is going to make it inevitable that Russia continues to invest in that and seeks to find new outlets, even if the war in Ukraine stops. So, I think we have to go back to the fundamental motivation of Mr. Putin. Is he in the process of building a better Russia for all citizens, or is he empire building and trying to build his legacy as, the greatest leader since Catherine the Great, or that's I think you have to enter into those kind of psychological questions. The fact is, the development of the war economy is coming at a huge cost to the civil economy. He is cannibalizing the civil economy to preserve the war economy.
In terms of the fall in trade that you mentioned, there certainly have been some comments and observations that EU trade, member state trade, with some of the Central Asian republics has risen very considerably since the invasion. In other words, there's transshipment going on, that European companies are selling to Central Asian countries and they are selling on to Russia. Are the things that European Union and the member states can do to discourage that or stop it outright?
Well, that's been one of my main tasks. I took up this job a year after the war started, or at least the full-scale invasion started in February of 22. I started in January of 23. And this was where we were starting to focus on precisely this question: how much circumvention, how much diversion of trade was there? And we drew up a first list of countries of interest, that is, goods which had previously gone directly from the EU to Russia were now going in similarly large numbers to other countries, and from there to Russia. And that first list gave us, as you say, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to a lesser extent, Kyrgyzstan, the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, where I've just come back from last night, Serbia, and the UAE. And so I had outreach to all of these countries, frequently jointly with my US and UK colleagues, sometimes all of us, sometimes in two of us, and sometimes alone. But we all had the same message: we accept that you don't want to align with our sanctions. And we have to acknowledge that our sanctions are not UN mandated. Now, there's a very good reason why they're not UN mandated. We always prefer UN mandated sanctions in the European Union, but on this occasion it was an impossibility. But of course, that then gives other countries who don't have the same vested interests in this conflict to say that they don't want to follow our sanctions. And I would always say, well, you don't want to follow our sanctions, but neither do you want to be an instrument of circumvention. And I would say this applied across several levels. I mean, one, there was particularly the financial sector who did not want to find themselves the subject of secondary sanctions or the being cut off from the dollar or the euro correspondent banking. And so immediately the financial sector in all of these countries was very anxious to comply with our sanctions and to avoid being cut off from the major currencies. Equally, we put together a short list of products of particular concern. These were what we call the battlefield products, products which the Ukrainian colleagues identified from doing autopsies on weapons on the battlefield, Western components which played an important part in making Russian weapons such as missiles, drones, artillery shells more accurate and therefore more lethal. And the Russians were heavily dependent upon these Western components. And these were the first items that we asked these countries to stop transshipping. And in one way or another, they have all done so, I have to say. And we've actually been quite successful in choking off those transshipments. And it has now become much harder, much less reliable, and much, much more expensive for Russia to procure these components than was the case, I would say 2 years ago. So this is what this is the work we're doing. I want to be honest. We will never stop circumvention. It would be an illusion to say that we can stop it completely. The objective, as I've just said, is to make it more complicated, slower and less reliable and more expensive. And I think on that, we have made quite a lot of progress.
And in terms of EU-based companies or companies manufacturing, producing in the EU, do you have powers to sanction those companies if their products are found in Russia, or particularly if the Ukrainians find them in weapons that have been used against them? Or is it a question of pointing this out to them and seeking their cooperation?
No. I mean, to be very clear, sanctions circumvention, deliberate and knowing sanctions circumvention, is a European crime. It's actually a crime under the treaty. And we adopted 2 years ago a directive harmonizing the criminal penalties for that across the member states, because previously there were wide divergences. As you can imagine, in some of the Central European countries, the penalty was very strong, and further westwards, the penalties were a bit lighter. That directive is in the process of being transcribed now, and I think the process is due to be finished at the level of member states this week. In this month, and we can already see growing prosecutions, criminal prosecutions of people who have been found guilty of deliberately circumventing sanctions. But I want to say and be very clear, the vast majority of our companies want to comply.
Yeah.
And frequently they get trapped into, unknowingly, into illicit procurement networks. And one of the things we've been able to do in the last 2 years is to provide member states and companies with much greater knowledge about suspicious actors or suspicious intermediaries in third countries, which they should be wary of. So, if you get an order for a product from a company that was created in the UAE in February 2022 that you've never dealt with before, that you can't find any track record of that company's previous business, and suddenly they're asking you to send them a big order of products which previously you sent to Russia, well, you need to be very, very careful, right? And I think companies have really, really upped their game in their ability to spot these kind of scams.
And presumably you put greater emphasis on products that could be used in weapons, for example, rather than, say, consumer products or pharmaceuticals in particular, that maybe the EU would have no interest in sort of being seen to harm the Russian people rather than the Russian economy. Is there any distinction made between types of products?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important to underline that our sanctions do not affect medicines or medical devices. They are perfectly free to be sold in the normal way. The same is true of agricultural products, by the way, in both directions. So we have not, because we didn't, precisely for the reasons you just mentioned, we didn't want to affect ordinary people. We all remember the horrible stories of the sanctions against Iraq when there were children dying because they couldn't get antibiotics. So I think we've learned a lot from that, and we're much more sophisticated in our approach. But we also, you're absolutely right. I mean, the luxury products thing is frequently talked about. We have sanctioned luxury cars, champagne, and so forth, and it is illegal to facilitate the trade in that. But to be very honest with you, if the Russians want to spend their hard-earned foreign currency on Porsches and Veuve Clicquot, good luck to them. It's no use. It's not helpful to their economy. It's certainly not helping their war economy. So we're going to spend much less effort policing that than we are policing goods which go to the military-industrial complex, whether that is direct components for weapons, or, for example, things like computer numerically controlled machines, CNC machines, which the Russians are desperately trying to buy so that they can try to produce the components they can no longer buy from the West. So we are laser focused on what are the products which really impact the Russian military-industrial complex.
Yeah, because this is something, certainly from an economics viewpoint, imports are money leaving the economy. We actually have an interest in making the sanctions work more effectively by selling more stuff to Russians, like luxury goods that can't help the war effort. But also in terms of pressuring Western countries to divest from Russia, again, that strikes me to some extent. One can understand why there would be pressure not to do business in a country that's so hostile. But on the other hand, those assets that Western countries have to sell off, they're going to be bought by the cronies close to Putin, which will actually strengthen his grip over the economy. So again, in that area, does it actually make sense? One can see why symbolically companies would want to divest, but making companies divest or forcing them to do so doesn't actually help Western interests.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in, we'd have to unpack a bit that whole argument. I mean, the first point is we didn't force Western companies to divest, but many immediately after the full-scale invasion chose to get out of Russia because they saw the writing on the wall. The ones who have problems are the ones who remain behind and who didn't get out quickly. And they're now finding that it's very difficult to get their capital out because the Russians are confiscating it or appropriating it. So I think the legal, and as you know, the rule of law doesn't exist in Russia. So people's legal rights are almost non-existent. I think the main benefit of what we've been able to do, I mean, we estimate that with the freezing of the central bank assets and the seizing of the assets belonging to oligarchs, Russia has about 450 billion euros less at its disposal than it would otherwise have. That is 3 to 4 times their annual defense budget. So that's an immediate hit from our sanctions regime. So you sometimes have to also think of the counterfactual. Imagine we didn't have sanctions and we were trading normally with Russia while they are waging this war. So, I'm now going to segue into my sort of, what's worrying about the Russian economy. Interest rate of 21%, the 7th largest interest rate in the world. Inflation of 10%, but most people think it's closer to 20 or 25%. Running down of the National Welfare Fund, which was a kind of rainy day fund of many billions, which has now been used to nearly 50% and which is expected to be run down by the end of this year. Almost zero investment in the productive civil economy. 40% of government expenditure now goes to the war economy, which is close to 6-8% of GDP. no new investment coming in from outside, massive loss of technology related to Arctic exploration and so forth, loss of revenues on the oil and gas side. I mean, now with the fall in the price of oil, to $60, Brent oil trading at $60, Urals oil has traditionally, throughout the entire last 3 years, it's been sold at a discount of between $10 to $13. So the Russians are now selling their oil probably even below $50. The break-even price for profit of the Russian economy is $69. Mm. So they are very badly affected by the sanctions and by what is happening, and that's why we as Europeans would argue this is the time to keep piling the pressure on, because this is the time to keep the pressure on Mr. Putin, because as you say, you can, it's a bit like Wile E. Coyote going over the cliff, right? I mean, it can look good having a pumped up war economy on steroids, but at a certain moment, there just isn't the substance of the real economy to keep things going. And economists differ as to when they project that crunch moment. People thought it was next year. Some people are saying it may be the second half of this year, but that, of course, also depends a bit on what happens with the bigger question of peace negotiations and resumption of economic activity, say, with the United States.
Before we get on to the United States, just want to ask you about that issue of seizing and freezing of Russian assets in the Eurozone system. Big debate as to whether they should be confiscated or simply remain frozen. There are arguments on both sides. What are your thoughts on that? Is it on the table, first of all?
I think it's very definitely on the table. I mean, we have, and as we say, we have immobilized. We have not seized nearly 300 billion of Russian central bank assets, of which around 200 billion are in Europe. Three things. One, we are already using these assets to provide a loan to Ukraine for the purposes of military equipment. We have not seized the capital, we have not seized the interest, but there were windfall profits being made by these investments in Euroclear, the company in Brussels that managed the security deposits. They were making windfall profits. We have seized that legally. We've taken possession of that, and we are using that to fund a loan through the G7 for weapons supplied to Ukraine. First point. Second point: the capital of these assets is not going back to Russia anytime soon. That's absolutely clear. They are immobilized, and we will not allow them to return to Russia until we are satisfied with the final settlement, if ever there is one. The third point is we are all agreed that one way or the other they will be used to facilitate they will be leveraged to help the reconstruction of Ukraine, either directly or indirectly. So it may be that as part of some final settlement, there's an international fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Russia may agree to contribute to this, and then maybe the assets can be allowed to go back in function of what Russia puts into the common pot. If Russia doesn't contribute, then I think the pressure to make those funds available to Ukraine in compensation for Russia's failure to contribute to the damage it itself caused in Ukraine will provide a much different legal context. The difficult debate at the moment is whether there is a solid legal basis for seizing the capital. And there are, as you say, different legal interpretations. And I don't think there's any definitive view taken. But I want to emphasize they're not going back to Russia anytime soon, and they will be used to leverage money for the reconstruction of Ukraine.
And there's certainly some concern in the central banking system about the precedent it would set. And some concern that it could lead to capital flight out of the EU. Given what's happened in recent months with talk of capital flight out of the US and where's safe haven, has that debate shifted at all? Can you say anything about that? A sensitive subject, I know.
Well, as you say, it is sensitive, and I think the European Central Bank at one point made an intervention saying, be careful. I have also heard the counter-argument that the seizure of the assets has kind of now been discounted in international circles. I mean, people understand that this has happened. They understand why it's happened, and they know that it's not a situation that is likely to recreate itself for other investments. So I've heard both sides of that argument, and that definitely is part of the discussion. I agree.
Moving on to the US, has your counterpart in the US been appointed? And if so, what's the relation? How's the relationship between your office and the sanctions enforcement office in the US? How has that evolved and changed? Is there still contact, etc.?
Well, there's still contact, but basically all of the leadership appointed by Biden have left, and there has been no new leadership appointed by the incoming, by sorry, not the incoming, the Trump administration now. So I still have very good contacts with all the people I was working with at a sort of secondary level with the old administration. But to be very frank, they're not able to give me a very clear indication as to what will be the final direction of travel decided by the administration. That's still something very much being decided in the White House, and none of us really have the answer to that.
And making it even more complicated, I just read a report this morning saying that in the Senate, the Republican leader in the Senate is pushing strongly for new sanctions on Russia and some pretty tough sanctions, including countries that trade with Russia for energy. In terms of the relationship, the role of the legislature in the US, they clearly still have clout, and Schumer seems to believe that he could get a 2/3 majority, and that would give the Senate more power than the president. Just thoughts, having spent time in the US and seen how the executive and the legislature interact on these issues. Any thoughts on how that could play out?
Well, I mean, I think many of us are surprised at how quiet the legislature has been relative to the hyperactivity of the administration through executive orders. I think it would be a very healthy development if in future the Congress reasserted itself a bit. And I know that there are many people in Congress who take quite a critical view of Russia's role in Ukraine and would like to see a tougher line taken. You get slightly conflicting messages from the White House. I mean, frankly, sometimes President Trump talks about new sanctions, tougher sanctions. Sometimes he talks about lifting sanctions. So honestly, I think looking at this from a distance, it's very difficult to say how this will evolve. It's interesting that there are people in the Congress who claim they can move this forward, but I have to say, until now, it appears that the Republican members of Congress take their lead much more from the White House than they do from fellow Democrat members of Congress.
As you say, lots of potential outcomes. But if the United States were to lift its own sanctions and decide that it wanted to reset relations with Russia, that puts the European Union in a difficult position, clearly. How, I know it's hypothetical, speculative, it's maybe you don't feel you can comment on it, but do you feel the EU would maintain their sanctions, and how difficult would that be without cooperation with the United States?
Well, I mean, I think the great strength of the sanctions we have now has been the unity of not just the G7, but the kind of G7 plus. So we've had all the G7 members, but we've also had South Korea, we've had Australia, New Zealand, we've had huge European solidarity. Norway, Switzerland has aligned with our sanctions, which is unprecedented for Switzerland. So I think the unity of the sanctioning coalition has been a very strong point, and we would very much hope that that can be maintained. If however much we might regret it, the US decided no longer to continue with that unity and unilaterally to lift some of its sanctions, there would obviously be a weakening of the impact of the sanctions. But I go back to the numbers I quoted earlier. We trade much more, or we used to trade much more with Russia than the United States did. The United States was not a very important trading partner of Russia. So it would be symbolically perhaps interesting for Russia to have some US sanctions lifted. But I think the real substance comes from the European sanctions. And it was interesting to note that when there were some discussions a couple of weeks ago around the the Black Sea ceasefire potentially, the Russians tried to tie that to the lifting of swift sanctions on an agricultural bank, which would have been a European sanction, would have required the Europeans to move. Interestingly, the Americans never approached us about that. And I think the strong view expressed by President von der Leyen a couple of weeks ago is that we will maintain our sanctions for as long as the conditions which caused us to impose them remain. And Kaja Kallas, the High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, yesterday said the same thing in the Financial Times. So I think the Europeans will continue to maintain our sanctions as long as we do not see the conditions for a sustainable and lasting peace settlement, which certainly seems very far removed at this point.
And just moving away from Russia as we move towards the end, just talk about sanctions and sanction cooperation more widely globally. There's talk recently that the Chinese are lifting sanctions on MEPs, and there might be other moves on the EU side. Are you involved in those sanctions? And
no, fortunately, I mean, for better or for worse, Dan, my focus is Russia. So we have 43 sanctions regimes, and I'm only dealing with the Russia sanctions. I mean, on the China ones, as you know, the Chinese rather strangely imposed these bizarre sanctions a couple of years ago, which halted the progress on the common investment agreement, which was nearly finalized, and that drew everything to a halt. I think it's great if they're revising that. I think relations with China are complicated, but it's a hugely important partner, and it would be great if we could get rid of some of those irritants that have prevented further cooperation.
David, thanks so much for giving us your time. It's always a pleasure to have you back at the Institute. It was extremely informative. Certainly brought me up to speed, and I'm sure many other people with the sanctions, EU sanctions on Russia and all of the related issues. So many thanks for your time, particularly on a day off.
Okay, my pleasure, and best of luck to everyone at the Institute.
Thanks, David. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.